So I was traveling a lot over the summer and I haven't had a chance to make this video, but I'm very excited to share that I have a new journal article that was published in June of this year. It was published in the Zeitschrift for Dialektische Theologie, which is the journal for dialectical theology. It's quite an honor for me to be published in this journal. It was founded in 1985 and has been a leading Barth-studies journal in Germany and really internationally. My article in this journal is about Barth's famous 1919 lecture, The Christian in Society, which is more commonly known as the Tambach lecture. It was a lecture that made Barth famous in Germany, and it has been an important lecture of his for understanding Barth's earlier work. And so right now you can go and read my article if you're interested. I'll post a link in the description. But in this video, I just want to briefly summarize my argument in this article, as well as what I hope it contributes to scholarship. And so I really do two things in the article. First, I present a reading of the Tambach lecture, which analyzes the various themes that Barth's pulling on. And I do that to argue against a quietist interpretation of the lecture. But the second thing I do is something I think that's quite unique, which is to examine a speech that Barth gave only 2 months after Tambach, which was an explicitly socialist speech. It's called On Being Right and Wrong. That speech isn't available in English, but for my analysis of it is one of the first, at least to my knowledge, the first to appear in English. And I connect it with Tambach to augment my argument about the lecture not being quietistic. And so in the socialist speech, Barth endorses socialism as a conditional necessity. So that contradicts some of the religious socialists who interpreted his Tambach lecture as being a move away from socialism. So I found it really interesting that 2 months later, Barth was giving an explicit socialist speech. And so to my knowledge, this article was one of the first to draw this connection between the two speeches and to analyze it in English. And so I think in that regard, that's, I think, what the novel contribution of the article is. And ultimately, my argument is that Barth's lecture, his Tambach lecture, is not a move towards apolitical quietism. That was, like I said, a critique that the religious socialists, particularly Ragas, had made against Barth's lecture. Ragas went so far as to suggest that the lecture degraded the Blumhardt legacy and that Barth had entirely disassociated theology from politics. And so that's kind of the reading that I'm pushing back against. And so in my reading, I analyze some of Barth's early themes, especially the many themes that emerge. It's a really dense lecture, and there's a lot that he kind of throws in there that I tried to disentangle, but they're really interesting themes. A lot of some of the big hits of Barth's earlier thought, the holy otherness of God is involved in there. There's also the famous metaphor about describing a bird in flight. And Barth repeatedly used that metaphor later in life as well. And typically he used it to explain the task of theology. But what I found interesting here is that in the Tambach lecture, Barth is describing it's a political context, right? So God as movement towards history in the political sense is being understood as this bird in flight. And so it's a movement that we cannot assume to have any mastery or claim over God, or that we can claim God's endorsement of any sort of static cause or program. And so a big part of the lecture is Barth is critiquing what he calls hyphens. So the Christian social, or the Christian Democrat, or Christian socialist, or religious socialist, right? Any of these hyphens between those two words, he critiques that partially because of this emphasis on the livingness of God, on the non-objectifiability of God, which is all contained within that bird and flight motif. But he makes a few really interesting comments about hyphens short-circuiting both of the concepts. And so, for example, Christian socialist, the hyphen between that short-circuits both what is truly Christian and what is truly socialist. And so his point isn't to separate those so dogmatically, but rather to let them stand on their own feet. So not to try and Christianize socialism or to socialize Christianity, but to fully embrace the distinction between them. And I find that a really interesting approach, a really interesting argument. because I think it rehumanizes the task of politics. I think that one of Barth's concerns is that God becomes kind of an object, or that we try to claim mastery over God in our political speech. And so it's very common to talk about God being on our side or on this side or whatever else. And I think Barth later developed some really clear moves around what liberation theologians would call the preferential option for the poor. And so he has moves in that direction, and clearly if we're following God's movement towards history, I think that movement is in and through the poor and oppressed. And Barth sort of gets there later, but in this lecture he's really trying to critique some of the religious socialists who had kind of tried to claim that God was on their side or endorse their particular program or whatever it was. And so whether or not that's entirely fair to the religious socialists is another question, but I think it's an interesting move that he's doing. And so I'm trying to analyze how he's conceiving of political theology at this point. And I really am overarching, one of the overall arguments I'm making in this article is that Barth's move towards the theological question, to emphasize the theological, is not a move away from a concern for the political situation, but it's actually a move to deepen a more theologically informed politics. It's a move to strengthen some of those connections, not to weaken them. And so I explore some of those things, of course, within Tambach, but I also connect it with this really fascinating socialist lecture, which is called On Being Right and Wrong. And I pull out a number of the connections between the two lectures in a way that I think is really interesting. And I was really quite surprised that there hasn't been enough discussion about this later socialist speech. And so I think my analysis of that social speech is really a unique part of my argument, and something that I'm proud of, especially working with the original German and being able to kind of understand it and interpret it, I think is something really interesting. And so, like I said, you are welcome to read it. I have the link linked in the description below. Unfortunately, the reason why I did that is because the journal doesn't offer anything but a print version of articles, and so it's only available in this version, but I scanned it in and posted have it up on my website. And so you're welcome to read it there. I of course would recommend, if you have a copy at your library, at your university or something, to pick it up there. But if you do read the article and you enjoy it or have questions or critiques or anything like that, please let me know. But thank you so much for watching this. Again, I'm thankful for everybody that watches this channel, supports me, and I'm really proud of this journal article being out. This is now my second major academic journal article that's been published. I have another one that's been accepted that will come out later this year that I'm excited about. But yeah, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.